The laundry room smelled like bleach and hot cotton, fluorescent lights humming their endless mechanical prayer. Margaret Walsh stood alone at the folding table, each scrub folded with the precision of someone who had once folded flags for the dead. Crease. Press. Align the sleeves so they formed perfect right angles. Her hands moved through the motions with muscle memory older than her 3 years at Seattle General, older than her civilian nursing license, older than the life she was supposed to be living in Jacksonville. The fabric whispered under her palms. Scrub top. Scrub pants. Scrub top. Scrub pants. The rhythm was meditative, the kind of order that came from having survived places where disorder meant body bags. She didn't look up when the door opened at 06 for 7 hours. Dr. Richard Ashford stood in the doorway for exactly 7 seconds before Margaret registered his presence. That was the thing about Special Forces training, you learned to sense weight in rooms before you saw it. The shift in air pressure. The change in how light fell across tile. Ashford was watching her with the expression of a man who had just discovered something that threatened him. Not physically. Institutionally. Margaret folded another scrub top. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. Her hands were steady. The left shoulder bore 3 parallel scars visible only if you knew where to look, and only if the fluorescent light hit at exactly the right angle. She kept them hidden under 3/4 sleeves. The dog tag beneath her scrub top, the one on the broken chain she hadn't removed in 2,847 days, lay against her sternum like a secret. Like a weight. Like a promise she'd made to 6 people who didn't have names anymore. Impressive work ethic, Ashford said finally. His voice had the texture of someone used to being obeyed. Most staff wouldn't volunteer for the laundry rotation on a cardiac shift. Shifts need coverage. Margaret's voice was quiet. Deferential. The voice of someone who had learned to take up less space in the world. Someone has to do it. She didn't mention that the laundry room was quiet. That the fluorescent hum and the smell of industrial soap and the isolation suited her better than the cardiac unit's relentless beeping and fluorescent whiteness. That some people were made for crowds and some people, people like her, had learned to prefer places where no one asked questions. Ashford stepped into the room fully now, and the air pressure changed again. Margaret could feel his assessment the way a sniper feels wind direction. He was reading her the way doctors read charts, looking for data points. Looking for anomalies. 15 years I've been chief of surgery here, he said, moving toward the folding table. I know my staff. Know who belongs and who doesn't. You're competent. Efficient. But there's something about you that doesn't quite fit the pattern. Margaret folded another scrub. Her jaw tightened fractionally, a response so small it would be invisible to most people. Ashford wasn't most people, he was a chief of surgery, which meant he spent his professional life reading the subtle tells of human bodies. But he was reading the wrong language. Just a nurse, she said quietly. Trying to do the work. No. Ashford leaned against the table, and Margaret could smell his cologne, something expensive, something that cost more than her weekly salary. You're something else. Someone else. There's military in your posture. Military in the way you move. Military in how you handle stress without your voice shaking. He paused. 3 years you've been here. You take the worst shifts. You never ask for time off. You never socialize. You wear long sleeves in July. You carry yourself like you've got authority you're not using. Margaret set down the scrub in her hands. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical prayer. Somewhere in the distance, a ventilator wheezed its rhythmic breath. The hospital at 06 for 7 was quiet, the night shift hadn't quite ended, the day shift hadn't quite begun, and in that liminal space, everything felt fragile. I'm a nurse, Margaret said. Her hands rested on the folded scrub, palms down. I work hard. That's all. Ashford smiled, and it wasn't a kind expression. You know General James Morrison was admitted to cardiac last night? 4-star. Military escort. The kind of patient who comes with federal security clearances. He watched her face carefully. You're going to be his assigned nurse. I want you to know something. Anything you observe, anything you do, anything you communicate about that patient comes through me first. Are we clear? Of course, Doctor. I mean it. His voice had developed an edge now, like a scalpel finding resistance in tissue. That man is a national asset. He's not a regular patient. He doesn't get regular treatment protocols. He gets what I say he gets. What I authorize. Do you understand the hierarchy here? Margaret's hands clenched fractionally. Her fingernails pressed small crescents into her palms. But her voice remained steady, level, the practiced voice of someone who had learned to swallow words the way other people swallowed pills. I understand, Doctor. She didn't understand. She understood something else entirely. She understood that Ashford had just identified her as a threat without knowing why. That he was establishing dominance because he sent someone in his hospital who might not accept his authority without question. That he was marking territory the way apex predators mark territory, with words sharp as claw marks. The cardiac unit that morning was chaos wrapped in routine. Monitors beeped their staccato rhythms. Nurses moved like people conducting an orchestra only they could hear. General Morrison lay in bed for post-op from emergency cardiac surgery, an LAD dissection court at the last possible moment, a 3-vessel bypass that had taken 5 hours and cost the hospital approximately $287,000 in equipment and surgical time. He was 63 years old, built like someone who had spent a lifetime in military discipline, and he was asleep in the way soldiers sleep, not peacefully, but with an awareness lurking underneath the surface. Margaret checked his vitals at 0800 hours. Blood pressure 134/78. Heart rate 88. O2 sat 97% on 2 liters nasal cannula. Temperature 37.1 Celsius. The numbers were acceptable. But when she pulled up his labs, her spine straightened imperceptibly. Cardiac enzymes were elevated. Not critically, not yet, but elevated. Troponin I at 3.2 when normal was less than 0.04. CKMB at 18% of total CK. And the EKG showed ST segment changes in the inferior leads, subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking specifically for it. Margaret stood there for exactly 9 seconds, reading the data, processing what her training told her. What her instinct told her. Her hands grew very still. When Ashford appeared at the nurse's station at 08 for 7 hours, she was waiting. She approached him with the kind of careful deliberation a person uses when handling explosives. General Morrison's cardiac enzymes are still elevated, she said quietly. Troponin at 3.2. His EKG shows ST segment changes in the inferior leads. She paused, choosing each word with precision. Discharging him 12 hours post-op cardiac surgery seems premature. The changes suggest myocardial stress. Ashford's face underwent a subtle transformation. Not anger, not yet. Something more dangerous, dismissal. His EKG changes are normal post-op, he said flatly. Stress response from surgery. Enzymes will normalize within 48 hours. He turned back to his computer. Besides, his Federal Protection Detail is requesting immediate transfer to Walter Reed. General Morrison will be discharged at 1,000 hours. Doctor, Margaret's voice was still quiet, still deferential. But there was something underneath it now, a note like a knife drawn very slowly from a sheath. The guidelines for post-cardiac surgery patients recommend monitoring elevated troponin for a minimum of 72 hours. ST segment changes warrant nothing. Ashford stood, and his voice dropped to the kind of volume that kills conversation in hospital rooms. You're a bedside nurse. You are not a cardiologist. You are not a surgeon. You are not in charge of discharge decisions. That position belongs to me. To people with credentials. To people with authority. He said the last word very deliberately, letting it hang in the air between them like a weapon. When you overstep your scope of practice, when you question my medical decisions in front of patients and families, when you attempt to play doctor, you undermine the entire hospital hierarchy." His voice remained level, but his eyes had developed a particular quality, the expression of someone who had just made a decision about another person's future. "Is that clear, Ms. Walsh?" Margaret's hands were at her sides. Her breathing was controlled, diaphragmatic, the kind of breathing soldiers learn when they need to stay functional under fire. Around them, the cardiac unit continued its work, monitors beeped, fours dripped their careful calculations of medication and time, nurses moved through the controlled chaos of keeping people alive. "Yes, doctor," Margaret said. But the room went dead quiet for 3 seconds. That was all it took for Ashford to realize he had accomplished something. He had created a moment where everyone within earshot understood the hierarchy. Where everyone understood that Margaret Walsh, for all her competence, her steady hands, her quiet authority, was subordinate. Was beneath. Was just a nurse. She returned to General Morrison's room at 0855 hours and began preparing discharge paperwork. Her movements were precise. Her handwriting was steady. No tremor. No emotional response beyond what was necessary to function. This was what 3 years of civilian life had taught her: how to swallow your expertise. How to accept decisions made by people with less knowledge but more authority. How to watch someone walk out the door toward a problem you had identified and could do nothing about except document it and pray. At 1015 hours, General Morrison left Seattle General. His Federal Protection Detail escorted him to a waiting sedan. Margaret watched from a distance, her hand resting on the medication cart, her pulse steady, her face impassive. The break room smelled like burned coffee and someone's lunch left in the refrigerator too long. Margaret sat at the small table with her own lunch, a sandwich she didn't want, a bottle of water, her phone face down in front of her. She had worked here 3 years. 3 years of 12-hour shifts, of staying late, of taking the worst rotations, of being competent and invisible. The door opened at 1130 hours. 3 nurses entered, stopped simultaneously when they saw her, exchanged looks. One of them, Jennifer, who had worked cardiac for 5 years, turned around and left. The other 2 sat at the opposite end of the table, their bodies angled away, their conversation quieter than before. Margaret ate her sandwich. She didn't taste it. She watched the fluorescent lights flicker in their mechanical rhythm and didn't taste anything at all. By the following Monday, the written warning appeared on the unit board. Dr. Ashford had posted it himself, printed on official hospital letterhead, dated with military precision. Insubordination. Failure to respect medical hierarchy. Inappropriate challenge to surgeon's clinical judgment. The language was careful, professional, impossible to challenge. The implication was clear: Margaret Walsh was a problem. She read it standing alone at the nurses' station. Her jaw clenched. Her hands formed fists. And then her fingers uncurled, one by one, because she had learned discipline in places where discipline meant survival. The Hippocratic Oath didn't have a hierarchy clause. But Margaret Walsh, who had taken that oath and also taken others far older and far more binding, had learned that some things weren't worth saying aloud. She folded her hands instead and returned to work, her 3-year deployment in civilian life continuing as if nothing had changed. Her dog tag pressed against her sternum like a secret. Like a weight. Like a promise to 6 people who couldn't ask her to keep it anymore. The warning notice was still warm from the printer when Dr. Ashford's voice carried down the corridor. Margaret heard it before she saw him, that particular timbre he used when he decided someone was about to be dismantled. She was checking General Morrison's cardiac monitor, noting the rate, the rhythm, the subtle elevation in his troponin levels that had climbed since the morning shift. The numbers were speaking a language Dr. Ashford had chosen not to listen to. Nurse Walsh. My office. Now. Not a request. The words arrived like an order from someone who'd forgotten that nurses didn't follow military chains of command. She finished documenting the reading in the electronic chart, 08 for 7 hours, rate 96, interval stable but trending, and moved toward the corridor where Dr. Ashford stood with his arms crossed, his expression already composed into something resembling judicial authority. Behind him, visible through the doorway of room for 12, sat General Morrison's wife and 2 adult daughters. They were watching. Margaret understood immediately that this wasn't a private conversation. This was a performance. Inside the private room, Dr. Ashford positioned himself between Margaret and the General's family like a barrier. His voice dropped into a register designed to carry weight and condescension in equal measure. "Nurse Walsh, you seem confused about your role here. Let me clarify, you take temperatures and change bedpans. You do not countermand my medical decisions. This is a 4-star general, not one of your frequent flyer drug seekers." He stepped closer, close enough that Margaret could smell the coffee on his breath, the cologne that cost more than her monthly rent. "Is that understood?" Margaret took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned to take in Helmand Province when incoming fire sent dust through a compound and you had exactly 3 seconds to move or die. Her hands remained at her sides. Her eyes met his without wavering. And then a single tear escaped, not from fear, not from shame, but from something deeper, something like the weight of carrying truths that couldn't be spoken. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact and spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper but somehow filled the entire room like a command structure reasserting itself. "The Hippocratic Oath doesn't have a hierarchy clause, Doctor." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. General Morrison's wife made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sigh. One of the daughters looked at her father. Dr. Ashford's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed to slits. He stepped back, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something colder, more calculated. "You're a nurse, sweetheart. Know your place." The word sweetheart landed like a physical thing, meant to diminish, to reduce her to something manageable and small. His fingers jabbed the air in her direction. "One more insubordination and you're done here. Finished. Do you understand me?" Margaret nodded once. She turned and left the room without another word, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, her face a mask of professional composure that revealed nothing of the rage moving beneath the surface like an undertow. Behind her, she heard General Morrison's wife murmur something urgent to her husband, heard the general himself attempt to say something in Margaret's defense, heard Dr. Ashford cut him off with the kind of authority that came from holding a title and believing that titles were everything. The break room the next morning was a study in human behavior. Margaret pulled her lunch from the refrigerator, a container of grilled chicken and brown rice, prepared 3 days in advance with the kind of methodical efficiency that came from years of planning meals around unpredictable schedules. She sat at the only open chair at a table where 4 other nurses were midway through their meals. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song above her head. The coffee maker gurgled in the corner, releasing that particular smell of burnt possibility that hospital break rooms always carried. The nurses didn't acknowledge her. One of them, Teresa, who Margaret had trained when she first arrived at Seattle General, collected her yogurt container with exaggerated slowness. Another gathered her crackers, her apple, the small yogurt cup she'd been working through. They stood in unison, a coordinated movement that felt choreographed by something larger than individual decision. As they moved toward the door, one of them, Margaret thought it was Rachel from the night shift, leaned close enough to be heard over the ambient noise and said the word loud enough to carry, "Pushy." The others didn't contradict her. They simply walked out together, their departure leaving Margaret alone at a table designed for 6 people, with nothing but the hum of the lights and the sound of her own chewing, which suddenly seemed unbearably loud. She didn't look up. She didn't react. She simply continued eating, mechanically, deliberately, the way you'd consume fuel. But beneath her collar, visible for just a moment as she reached for water, the broken chain glinted in the fluorescent light, a small silver glint that caught the edge of something, a reminder that she was carrying more than just a nursing credential into this room. 2 days passed in the peculiar rhythm of hospital time, where 48 hours could contain a dozen crises or feel like an eternity of routine. Dr. Ashford had scheduled the morning huddle for 0700 hours in the main conference room. 23 staff members filtered in: nurses, respiratory therapists, one of the physician assistants, the charge nurse supervisor who had direct authority over Margaret's schedule. They took seats in a semicircle, the kind of formation that made individual eyes feel like spotlights. Dr. Ashford stood at the front of the room with a piece of white paper in his hand. Laminated. Official looking. He smiled before he spoke, that particular smile that contains no warmth, only the satisfaction of someone who had just positioned themselves to deliver maximum impact. Before we start today's briefing, there's something we need to address as a department. Standards. Professionalism. Respect for the chain of command. He walked toward the unit bulletin board with deliberate slowness, moving like someone who understood stagecraft. Pinned the paper directly in the center, where no one could avoid seeing it. Then he turned back to face the assembled staff and began to read aloud, his voice carrying each word with theatrical precision. Nurse Margaret Walsh. Written warning. Insubordination. Failure to respect medical hierarchy. Overstepping scope of practice. Final warning prior to termination. He paused after each phrase, letting the words settle into the room like sediment. This is the standard we expect. This is what happens when someone forgets their position. 20 staff members stared at their shoes, their laps, the water bottles in their hands. Nobody made eye contact with Margaret. The charge nurse supervisor examined her fingernails with sudden intense focus. One respiratory therapist pretended to check a text message on his phone, his eyes deliberately averted. Dr. Ashford wasn't finished. He added, with the kind of smirk that suggested he'd been holding this line in reserve, waiting for the optimal moment of impact, perhaps Florence Nightingale here needs remedial training on the chain of command. A few people shifted uncomfortably. A couple made sounds that might have been small laughs or might have been throat clearings. The room had become a place where cruelty was being normalized, distributed, shared among witnesses as a kind of collective complicity. Margaret stood when the huddle concluded. She walked to the bulletin board while conversations resumed around her, people gathering papers, checking phones, deliberately avoiding the space where she was reaching for the notice. She took it down without ceremony. Her fingers folded it once, along the vertical center line. Folded it again. A third time, precise creases each time, until the warning was compressed into a small rectangle that fit perfectly into her scrub pocket. It took her exactly 14 seconds. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody walked over. The room simply reorganized itself around her absence, closing the space she'd occupied the way water fills in the wake of a ship. But that wasn't the worst part. By that afternoon, General Morrison's cardiac rhythm had begun to deteriorate in ways that Margaret had predicted 2 days earlier. The elevated troponin levels weren't plateauing. They were climbing. His EKG, which she checked during her shift, showed the subtle ST segment changes that Dr. Ashford had dismissed as post-surgical noise. His blood pressure was dropping incrementally, nothing dramatic enough to trigger immediate crisis protocols, but enough that the trajectory was clear. He was moving toward something worse, and Dr. Ashford wasn't answering his pages. Margaret documented everything with military precision. Chart notes that read like evidence. Vital signs that told a story. She flagged the concerning trends in the electronic system, using the communication protocols that Dr. Ashford had instructed her never to bypass. She called the cardiology consult line and left a message. She called it again at 1,600 hours and again at 1,900 hours. By 2,100 hours, she documented 12 separate concerning findings and 11 documented attempts to escalate the concern. The general's wife had begun to notice. She asked Margaret quietly, while Dr. Ashford was reviewing charts at the nursing station, whether something was wrong. Margaret chose her words with the careful precision of someone speaking across a minefield. General Morrison's numbers are trending in a direction we want to monitor closely. Has he mentioned any chest discomfort? Any shortness of breath? The wife's face went pale. She reached for the call button. Dr. Ashford appeared within 90 seconds, his expression already arranged into something dismissive. I've reassured the general and his family, he said to Margaret, his voice a blade wrapped in politeness. I don't appreciate you creating unnecessary alarm. He turned to the general's wife with his practiced smile. Your husband is recovering beautifully. Sometimes post-operative patients experience a little anxiety. It's completely normal. He adjusted the fall line, checked the monitor with the casual glance of someone who'd already decided what he was looking at, and left. Margaret stood by the bed as the evening shift transitioned into night. The general was sleeping, his respiration shallow. His oxygen saturation at 94%. His heart rate climbing toward 110. She watched the monitors like she was reading a book written in vital signs and trending numbers, and the story being told was one of deterioration, of a cascade that would accelerate if the next several hours went unobserved. She had 6 more hours in her shift. 6 hours until the night nurse, Derek, arrived to take over. 6 hours to document everything and hope that someone with authority would finally listen. By 01:47 hours, she was alone on the floor with 7 patients, the ambient sound of the hospital reduced to its essential elements, ventilators, cardiac monitors, the distant hum of fax systems pushing climate-controlled air through corridors. The fluorescent lights cast everything in shades of exhaustion. Her own heartbeat was steady, trained, the way it had been in Helmand Province when you were the only one awake and watching. General Morrison's monitor showed a rate of 118. His troponin level, flagged in the system at 0130 hours, read 2.47. Critical range. She had called the hospitalist on call. Had left a message. Was waiting for callback. And that's when she heard it. The sound of the stairwell door opening, the specific click of metal against metal that came from someone moving with purpose rather than casual hospital traffic. Margaret's nervous system recognized it instantly, that particular quality of movement that came from someone trained in tactical positioning, someone moving with the kind of awareness that had nothing to do with finding the bathroom or checking on a family member. She'd heard that sound in Helmand Province approximately 437 times. She'd learned to recognize it the way animals learn to recognize the precise frequency of a predator's call. She was at the security alert button before conscious thought caught up to muscle memory. Her finger hovered for 1 heartbeat. Then pressed. Silent alarm. 10 seconds for response. The alarm hit at 0200 hours. Silent. The kind of silent that cuts through sleep and triggers muscle memory in people who've trained for it. Margaret was checking Morrison's post-op labs when she heard it, not through the overhead system, but through the tactical vibration pattern that meant restricted access breached. Ground floor. Trauma entrance. Unauthorized entry with a weapon. The hospital's emergency alert system didn't use those codes. But the silent alarm on her phone, the one she'd kept hidden for 3 years, the black flip phone with a direct line to a Pentagon switchboard she was never supposed to use, that phone had just buzzed once with a text, "Shooter." Morrison floor. ETA 90 seconds. She moved without thinking. The moves came from 18 years back, from a compound in Kandahar where she'd learned to read threat patterns the way most people read facial expressions. Her hands were already moving toward Morrison's full line, checking his sedation level, assessing his mobility. The general was sleeping, post-op, vulnerable in a way that made her chest tight. Cardiac complications from Ashford's premature discharge. Heart rate elevated. Blood pressure unstable. And someone with professional tactical knowledge was coming for him right now. Footsteps in the hallway. Not the soft shuffle of night staff. Not the purposeful walk of security doing rounds. This was different. This was the measured pace of someone moving with a weapon in hand, moving like they knew exactly where they were going. Margaret's hand went to Morrison's shoulder and she leaned close, voice low and urgent, "General. Wake up. Now." His eyes snapped open, the kind of instant awareness that comes from decades in command. She didn't have time for explanations. "We're moving. Don't ask questions." She was already disconnecting his non-critical monitors, leaving the cardiac leads and the pulse ox to dangle, unplugging me for pump and grabbing the pole. The hospital bed was standard, for wheels, about 847 pounds with Morrison's frame and the mattress. She'd calculated the weight the moment she'd helped transfer him here. The bathroom was 14 feet away, behind the tile wall. The only other exit from the room besides the door the shooter was seconds away from reaching. Her shoulder was screaming at her. Old shrapnel scar tissue didn't like sudden exertion, but she ignored it and pushed. The bed moved fast. Not fast enough. She could hear them now, 2 sets of footsteps, maybe 3, moving with the kind of precision that meant military training. The general reached up and grabbed the four-pole to steady himself, his instincts kicking in even as his post-operative body protested the movement. "Get down," Margaret said. Not a request. Not a suggestion. A command. She shoved the bed against the bathroom wall just as the door exploded inward. The sound was like thunder in a confined space. The door handle punched through the drywall, the hinges screaming metal. A figure in tactical gear filled the doorway, weapon raised. Not law enforcement. Not hospital security. The stance was wrong, the gear was wrong, and the way he moved through the room told Margaret everything she needed to know about his training level. Delta Force baseline. Maybe SEAL team level. Definitely not some random civilian with a grudge. The attacker's weapon came up, targeting the bed, and Margaret's entire body became a shield. She threw herself across Morrison's chest as the first burst came, 3 shots, controlled, professional. She felt the impacts before she heard them, felt the rounds chew through the air where Morrison's head had been a half-second before. Her own left shoulder detonated in pain, white-hot, the kind of pain that told her immediately what had happened. One of the rounds hadn't stopped in air. Then the grenade came. It came from the hallway, tossed in with the kind of precision that meant someone had measured the room, had planned this, had walked this location beforehand. The fragmentation grenade, maybe a Swedish M14 or an M67, Margaret's mind registered automatically, tumbled in an arc and landed near the foot of the bed. She had maybe 2.3 seconds before detonation. She didn't move. She pressed down harder on Morrison, her full body weight across his chest and face, and she became armor. The sound of the detonation was less explosive and more like being inside an industrial accident, like the whole room was contracting and expanding and tearing itself apart all at once. Margaret felt the shrapnel like a swarm of angry insects, felt it tear through her left side, felt her scrubs shred and her skin open in at least 7 different places. The pain was enormous and distant at the same time, adrenaline and training creating that strange gap between injury and sensation. Blood. Her blood. Pooling on Morrison's chest. She could feel it, warm and immediate, and she could also feel something else. Morrison was moving, trying to roll out from underneath her. "Stay still," she said, and her voice sounded normal. That wasn't normal. Nothing about this was normal. But she was already moving, already assessing, already operating on the level of pure tactical response that lived in the reptile brain underneath the scrubs and the name badge. The attacker was moving back, repositioning, ready to come forward and finish what he'd started. Margaret's hand went to Morrison's femoral artery. She could feel the rhythm of it through his thigh, could feel the flutter that meant the shrapnel had found something important. She applied pressure. Direct. Controlled. The kind of pressure that came from knowing exactly how many psi it took to collapse a major artery without causing tissue damage. Her other hand was already tearing at her own scrubs, at her own shoulder where the pain was now becoming information. Pain is data. Pain is tactical intelligence. The attacker took a step forward and Margaret moved, her body still shielding Morrison's, and her eyes fixed on the shooter with the kind of intensity that made his weapon hand hesitate for just a fraction of a second. That was all she needed. Her left hand, the one that wasn't applying pressure to Morrison's groin, reached for the forestand, for the tubing, for anything she could use. Hands that had held lives together. She had IV tubing in her right hand, looped it around her own left arm just above the elbow where the shrapnel had nicked her subclavian artery, and she twisted it tight. Once. Twice. Using her teeth for the final tightening, the way you did in Kandahar when you were down to your last tourniquet and it was either this or bleed out watching your team get extracted without you. The improvised tourniquet bit into her arm and the bleeding slowed from arterial spray to controlled seepage. She could feel the pressure points in her own shoulder where the shrapnel had entered, felt the grating of bone fragments, felt the shock trying to take her down, and pushed it aside like it was weather. "Morrison! Look at me," she said. His eyes met hers, and she saw the moment he understood that this nurse was something other than a nurse. "Stay conscious." "That's an order." His eyes widened. She didn't have time to explain how a civilian nurse gave orders like a commanding officer. The attacker was recovering, was reacquiring target, and Margaret's hand was still applying direct pressure to Morrison's femoral artery, pressure so precise, so practiced, so completely impossible for a standard hospital nurse to maintain, and her whole body was a barrier between the weapon and her patient. "Stay down!" She heard the shout from the hallway. "Hospital security." Finally, the attacker made a decision, tactical retreat or engagement with secondary targets, and Margaret made her own decision. She couldn't afford to collapse. She couldn't afford to show weakness. She could afford blood loss for maybe 4 more minutes before hypovolemic shock would start affecting her cognition, and she needed those 4 minutes clear. Boots on tile. Security moving fast. The attacker was moving out, moving back through the door he'd breached, and Margaret didn't relax. She kept the pressure on Morrison's femoral, kept the improvised tourniquet tight on her own arm, kept her breathing controlled and her voice level. "Patient has shrapnel wound to left femoral area. Possible arterial involvement. I'm applying direct pressure. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath and get a trauma surgeon down here. Now." The orders came out with the weight of 30 years of command, not with the diffidence of a registered nurse. She watched the security officers' faces shift, watched them recognize something they couldn't quite name but absolutely believed. Hospital lockdown procedures activated then, doors sealing, elevators shutting down, the coordinated chaos of a facility under attack. The hallway outside Morrison's room became a maze of protocol and procedure and officers moving with purpose. Sirens. Police. The weight of institutional response. And then Dr. Ashford appeared in the doorway. He saw her first, covered in blood, his blood and her blood mingled across her scrubs, her left arm wrapped in fur tubing that absolutely should not have been there, her body positioned over the general like she was trained for exactly this scenario, like she'd done this before, like she was something other than the quiet nurse who folded charts and questioned his medical judgment. His face went white, then red, then white again. Not shock. Calculation. Margaret recognized the expression because she'd seen it before in the faces of people trying to figure out how to survive a situation that had just gotten vastly more complicated. She didn't flinch. She didn't break eye contact. She kept her hand steady on Morrison's wound and she watched Dr. Ashford watch her. "The general's femoral artery is compromised," she said, her voice steady and authoritative. "I need a trauma surgeon and I need him in 3 minutes. Call them now." But Ashford was already moving, already turning, already reaching for his phone with a kind of expression that Margaret had seen before. The expression of a man deciding that the best way to survive exposure was to discredit the witness before the witness could be questioned. Behind closed doors, in the administrative corridors where Margaret couldn't follow, he would make calls to the hospital board. He would describe an inappropriate relationship. He would frame her tactical training as something sinister. He would reassign the security officers who'd seen her competence. He would doctor the narrative before the narrative could be documented. But that calculation, that desperate, calculating look, told Margaret everything she needed to know about what was coming next. The attending physician doesn't ask her permission. He never does. Dr. Ashford strides into the trauma bay at 0247 hours, still wearing yesterday's cologne, eyes fixed on Margaret's blood-soaked scrubs and the improvised tourniquet constructed from fur tubing cinched around General Morrison's bicep. His jaw tightens. Not with concern for the patient. With calculation. He sees the tourniquet. He sees her hand steady as surgical lasers, performing pressure point hemorrhage control on both Morrison and herself using techniques no civilian nurse should recognize. He sees the competence. The authority. The way she moved through that attack like someone who'd trained for this exact scenario. And he begins calculating how to bury it. By 0900 hours Friday morning, 3 days post-attack, Dr. Ashford has already made 7 phone calls. Margaret doesn't know about the calls yet. She's in the break room, left arm immobilized in a sling, ribs wrapped tight enough to make breathing deliberate, staring at a cup of coffee she hasn't touched. The coffee is cold. The cup sits in front of her like evidence. The suspension notice comes via email at 1047 hours. Then a printed copy delivered by hospital security at 1100 hours. Dr. Ashford doesn't deliver it himself, that would require him to face her. Instead, he sends the director of nursing, a woman named Patricia Chen, who avoids Margaret's eyes and reads from a prepared statement as if the words might contaminate her if she pauses to breathe them in. Possession of unauthorized medical equipment. Patricia's voice wavers. Creation of a dangerous situation. Violation of scope of practice protocols. Margaret reads the suspension notice once. Twice. The paper is standard white stock, probably £20 bond, the kind that shouldn't carry the weight to destroy 3 years of work. The notice cites the improvised tourniquet constructed from for tubing. The unauthorized hemorrhage control. The aggressive intervention in a code blue situation that may have contributed to patient destabilization. That last line isn't true. General Morrison's vitals had stabilized under her care. The medical record reflects that. Dr. Ashford knows it reflects that. This suspension was written backward from the conclusion he wanted to reach, the facts assembled to fit a predetermined narrative. Margaret Walsh is a liability. The real reason comes verbally, delivered with the precision of a man who has rehearsed it in the mirror. Dr. Ashford catches her in the hallway outside radiology at 1430 hours. His voice is loud enough for 3 passing residents to hear clearly. Your personal relationship with General Morrison created a conflict of interest that compromised your clinical judgment. He delivers this with the certainty of someone who knows there are witnesses. The attack may well have been precipitated by inappropriate contact you initiated with a high-ranking patient. We've reviewed the logs of your visits to his room, significantly more frequent than standard post-operative care protocols warrant. Margaret's hands don't shake. Her voice doesn't rise. The general's cardiac enzymes were still elevated. I was monitoring for arrhythmia. You were overstepping. Dr. Ashford's teeth show. And now a man is dead because of your boundary violations. The shooter targeted this hospital because of you. The shooter is not dead. The shooter is in federal custody, and Margaret has already been interviewed by the FBI and the Secret Service. She knows what the shooter said, that he was hired by a cartel Lieutenant Morrison had testified against in 2019, that the hit had nothing to do with Margaret Walsh or any patient relationship. Dr. Ashford knows this too. He read the same briefing memo. He doesn't care about the truth. He cares about control. By 1600 hours, Dr. Ashford has made his second call, this one to a man named Richard Bancroft, who sits on the hospital's board of directors and owes Ashford a favor for covering up a billing discrepancy that would have cost Bancroft's private practice group $340,000 in Medicare fraud settlements. The conversation lasts 14 minutes. Margaret doesn't hear this conversation. She hears about it indirectly when her employment status changes from suspended to terminated for cause at 1847 hours, and the termination letter arrives by courier at her home address rather than being delivered in person at the hospital. The letter is surgical in its precision. Following a comprehensive investigation into the events of April 18, 2024, Seattle General Hospital has determined that your employment is terminated effective immediately due to 1. Possession of unauthorized medical equipment in a clinical setting, 2. Creation of a dangerous situation through unauthorized clinical intervention, and 3. Repeated insubordination and failure to respect medical hierarchy. Your final paycheck, minus applicable deductions, will be mailed to your address of record within 7 business days. All hospital credentials, badges, and equipment must be returned by 5:38 p.m. today. Margaret reads the letter in her kitchen at 1920 hours. Outside, Jacksonville's April heat shimmers off the asphalt. The letter mentions nothing about her heroism. Nothing about stopping a trained shooter. Nothing about the fact that her improvised tourniquet likely prevented General Morrison from bleeding to death before paramedics arrived. The letter is a document that exists to protect Dr. Ashford from liability. Nothing more. But that isn't the worst part of what Ashford has orchestrated. The worst part is systemic, structural, invisible until you know to look for it. The two veteran security officers who witnessed Margaret's response to the attack, Marcus Webb and Henry Rodriguez, both former military, both with 20-plus years at the hospital, are reassigned to different shifts effective immediately. Marcus gets the 2100 to the 0600 graveyard rotation in the east basement corridor where nobody travels. Henry gets reassigned to the parking structure level 3, monitoring cameras of empty cars. Both men have seniority. Both positions are demotions. The staffing schedule for the ICU is rewritten. The nurses who worked the night shift when Margaret saved Morrison's life are rotated to day shift. The nurses who respect Margaret, who might corroborate her account of what happened, are distributed across different units and different hours, isolated from each other. The schedule is released as an operational efficiency adjustment, but it accomplishes something else. It ensures that anyone the Pentagon or the FBI might interview will find themselves separated from their peers, unable to coordinate their statements, vulnerable to administrative pressure. And Margaret's access card, the badge that worked every door in the hospital for 3 years, stops functioning at 1,605 hours on Friday afternoon. She discovers this when she attempts to return to the employee area to collect her personal items from her locker. The badge reader beeps red. Access denied. A security guard she's never seen before, someone hired this morning specifically for this purpose, stands blocking the door. "I have a badge," Margaret says quietly. "I need my things." "Your access has been revoked." The guard doesn't meet her eyes. "I can escort you to the main lobby to surrender the badge, or you can mail it back. Either way, you can't be in the employee area." Margaret hands him the badge. The plastic is warm from sitting in her pocket. The badge itself contains her ID photo. She's smiling slightly in that photo, still believing then that competence and dedication meant something in institutions. The guard takes it without comment and walks away, leaving her in the hallway outside a locked door that used to lead to places she belonged. She circles back through the main lobby at 1,620 hours, when the shift change is happening and nobody is paying attention. She slips through a side entrance near the cafeteria, down a service corridor, and into the laundry room at the far end of the basement level. The room smells like detergent and industrial bleach, like every hospital laundry room everywhere, the scent of contamination being stripped away, made clean. Her uniforms are stacked on a sorting shelf, cleaned and folded by the laundry service. 5 scrub tops, 3 pairs of scrub pants, all of them in the standard teal color that marks her as someone who belonged here. She takes them down from the shelf one at a time. The first top she holds is from her second week at Seattle General. She remembers because the hospital had done a photo shoot that day for their recruitment materials, and she'd been asked to wear this specific top because the colors photographed better under fluorescent lighting. She never appeared in the photo. She'd requested to be cut from it, and the photography director had respected that request, even though it left a gap in the image of the ICU team. She folds the top now, creasing each sleeve with mechanical precision. Her hands know this motion from muscle memory, the same motion she performed during her deployment to Helmand Province when she had to fold the flag that came back from the San Juan Valley containing what remained of Private First Class Aaron Kelton, a 19-year-old from Boise who died because an IED had been buried in the exact place intelligence said it wouldn't be. The fold is precise. Military. A crease you could cut yourself on. The second top. The third. Each one folded with the same precision, the same deliberate pressure, the same technique that transforms fabric into rectangles of identical dimension. The motion is muscle memory, but the memory itself is armor. As long as she's folding, she's doing something. As long as she's doing something, she's not thinking about the fact that her career has been erased in 72 hours by a man who called her a liar to her face and fabricated evidence to justify his conclusion. The dog tag chain is still around her neck, hidden beneath her street clothes. She can feel it sometimes, catching against her collarbone when she moves, the weight of metal that shouldn't exist anymore. Major Margaret Walsh. Service number O for 782196. Blood type O positive. The chain is broken in 3 places, the breaks from the night of the attack, from diving over General Morrison's body, from the fragmentation that had torn through her left shoulder. The chain is held together now with a piece of fishing line tied through the damaged links. She reaches beneath her collar and pulls the chain out. The dog tag catches the fluorescent light. The light is harsh and white and makes the metal look like it's glowing. She holds the tag for 17 seconds, she counts them, because counting is something to do other than thinking, and then she tucks it back beneath her collar. The laundry room's industrial clock reads 1,654 hours. Margaret folds the last scrub top. She stacks them on the sorting shelf in the precise order they were folded. She removes her employee badge holder from the lanyard, the badge is already gone, surrendered to the guard, and places it on top of the stack. Then she walks toward the employee exit, carrying everything she owns from this place in a small cardboard box that once held bottles of Flush. The box weighs almost nothing. 3 years of service, and what fits in a box that once held medical supplies. She passes the security checkpoint at 1,703 hours. The guard, a different guard, unfamiliar, doesn't ask to inspect the box. He just nods and presses the button that opens the employee exit door. The door swings outward into the Jacksonville heat. Behind her, Seattle General continues its operation. Doctors write orders. Nurses administer medications. Patients recover or they don't, their outcomes determined by the competence of the people who work in those buildings, by the quality of judgment in moments of crisis. Dr. Ashford walks the halls in his white coat, his reputation intact, his narrative controlled, his allies positioned in the right departments and the right shifts to ensure that anyone who might contradict his version of events is isolated enough to question whether they actually saw what they saw. The gunman who breached the hospital is being held in a federal facility pending trial for attempted murder of a United States military officer. The FBI has already determined that the attack had nothing to do with Margaret. The Secret Service has already cleared her. The Pentagon has already begun asking quiet questions about why such a highly decorated operative was working as a civilian nurse in a civilian hospital. But none of that information will reach Dr. Ashford's ears, because he has no security clearance to receive it, and the people who do have the clearance are already making other plans. Margaret doesn't know that yet. She stands in the parking lot at 1,704 hours, feeling the sun on her face like evidence of a world that continues regardless of who gets erased from it. The cardboard box is light in her hands. Her left arm aches where the shrapnel had torn through her shoulder. Her ribs ache where the fragmentation had caught her along the left side, where she'd thrown herself over the general to shield him from the blast. She has a secret that will transform everything, the secret of who she is, the secret of what she survived, the secret that the military buried when they gave her new social security number and ordered her to disappear into civilian life because officially, she and her team never existed. Because the operation they'd executed in Helmand Province to extract CIA personnel from a black site that officially didn't exist had to remain classified so thoroughly that even the people who'd authorized it could never acknowledge it. But that secret, hidden for 3 years beneath her scrubs and beneath her dog tag on its broken chain, is about to explode into the light. She has no idea what's about to walk through those hospital doors. The employee entrance doors burst open and Danny Walsh stood in the lobby carrying a shadow box like a relic from a cathedral. His 17-year-old frame moved with purpose he'd inherited from his mother, and in his hands, medals caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in geometric patterns. Hospital staff paused. Someone dropped a clipboard. The sound echoed across tile. "Mom, they need to see these, you saved his life." Danny's voice carried across the lobby, through the waiting room, up the stairwell. His words weren't a question. They were a declaration. "My mother is Major Margaret Walsh, United States Army Special Forces." Silence. Not the comfortable silence of a waiting room at rest. The silence of understanding being rewritten. Of reality shifting. A woman at the information desk stood up. 2 nurses stopped mid-stride. A security guard's hand fell away from his radio. Margaret turned from where she'd been standing near the elevators. Her eyes met her son's. For a fraction of a second, just a fraction, something passed between them. Then her posture shifted. Not dramatically. Her shoulders sat back perhaps a quarter inch. Her jaw set. The trembling wasn't fear. It was recognition. 3 years of silence, folded away like those scrubs in the laundry room, cracking open under the weight of truth her 17-year-old son had carried into this building. The elevator doors hissed open on the 3rd floor. A Navy SEAL in dress blues emerged, not the blue utilities, the dress blues, which meant official business, Pentagon business, business that didn't come to hospitals unless something had fundamentally changed. His aide followed, carrying a military file folder marked with the kind of security classifications that made people in suits nervous. They descended the stairwell and entered the lobby where Danny still stood, the shadow box held level, like a ship's compass pointing true north. The SEAL commander stepped forward. His movements had the fluid precision of someone who'd spent 15 years in water and combat and places between. "You're Margaret Walsh." His voice was quiet, but it filled the lobby. Voices like that came from having given orders at altitude, in darkness, with lives depending on words being heard correctly over wind and distance. "Yes," Margaret said. 2 words. That was all she offered. The deferential tone was gone. This wasn't a question requiring explanation. The SEAL's aide opened the file. His hands trembled slightly, emotion, not uncertainty. These were the hands of someone who'd been ordered to resurrect a ghost. Major Walsh. Silver Star recipient. He paused. The lobby had stopped breathing. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. Purple Heart, his voice cracked slightly. Deployed 4 times to Helmand Province in deep cover operations. Each decoration landed like a confession that the hospital had been wrong. That the woman in scrubs they dismissed, isolated, avoided in break rooms, this woman who folded bandages with the precision of someone who'd folded flags, had been operating at a level of service most of them would never comprehend. The Pentagon colonel who'd followed them in stepped closer to Margaret. His collar bore the insignia of someone who signed off on classified operations. "Major Walsh, your service record is being declassified effective immediately. The Army extends its formal recognition for your commitment and sacrifice." He was reading from something, but his eyes never left her face. He was watching for the moment when a burden lifted. He didn't see tears. He saw exhale. That mission to Helmand Province in 2019, the FBI agent said, she'd arrived quietly, badge on a lanyard, authority written into the space around her like a force field. The one you were ordered never to discuss. You extracted 12 CIA personnel under enemy fire in a hot zone. She looked at the gathered staff. The operation she was prohibited from mentioning saved 17 American lives. 17. Dr. Ashford stood near the pharmacy window. The color had drained from his face in stages, like someone watching a building burn from the inside. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "Dr. Ashford," the Pentagon colonel said, and his voice had changed. It was the voice of someone who'd built operational doctrine on understanding threats. "We have questions about your decision to terminate Major Walsh and your subsequent actions regarding the security footage from the night of the attack on General Morrison." "I was protecting hospital liability." Ashford's voice emerged thin, reedy, like a creature making noise to avoid being eaten. "By destroying evidence." The colonel stepped closer. "By reassigning the guards who witnessed Major Walsh's tactical response?" "By altering the incident report before the FBI arrived." He paused. "Those are obstruction charges, Doctor." Marcus Chen emerged from the IT office carrying a hard drive like a sword. Hospital IT veteran, former Marine, 19 years of service before taking a civilian position because his wife had cancer and needed him home. He'd been in the security office 2 nights ago when Ashford had arrived with admin credentials trying to delete footage from the attack. Trying to erase the moment when Margaret had moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone trained to make life-or-death decisions while rounds came through walls. "I saved every frame," Marcus said. His voice carried the weight of someone keeping promises. "And I reported the tampering to federal authorities this morning." The lobby monitors flickered to life. Security footage. Timestamp 2:14 hours. The gunman entering Morrison's room. Margaret moving like water, finding a path, no hesitation, no stumbling, her body understanding geometry and force and trajectory. Her hand on Morrison's bed. The grenade arc. Her body over his. The moment the shrapnel took her and she absorbed it like absorbing impact was her job, her calling, her only option. Then Ashford. Walking in. Making phone calls while Morrison was still bleeding. Before Margaret had even left the ER. Before the FBI had arrived. Before anything official had been decided. The timestamp showed his hand on his mobile. His face on the camera showed cold calculation. The CEO's face had gone the color of old bone. "Dr. Ashford, did you attempt to destroy evidence of an attempted murder?" Ashford's hands rose slightly. His voice cracked like ice, giving underweight. "I was protecting the hospitals. She violated protocols. Her military background was, she shouldn't have," words falling apart like infrastructure under load. The SEAL commander stepped close enough that Ashford had to look up at him. "She saved a 4-star general using skills she earned in combat while you were playing politics in an air-conditioned office. Not an opinion. A statement of fact. You tried to destroy her career the day after she took shrapnel, saving his life." "We're investigating the attack," the FBI agent said quietly. "The security reassignments you ordered destroyed witness access. The altered schedules prevented corroboration. That's obstruction. That's conspiracy." She paused. "Those are federal charges." The CEO's voice dropped to ice. "Dr. Ashford, you're suspended immediately pending investigation. Security will escort you out." The same words Ashford had used. The same tone. The same weight. Margaret watched him recognize his own cruelty reflected back at him and saw it land like a grenade in his chest. General Morrison's wife moved through the crowd. She was smaller than Margaret expected, but her movements carried the same command authority she'd seen in military families for 3 years, people accustomed to following dangerous men and keeping households together when dangerous men went to dangerous places. "You saved my husband twice," Morrison's wife said. "Once from incompetence. Once from murder." She took Margaret's hand. "Thank you." The room erupted. Applause that sounded like relief. Like the moment when you realized the person you dismissed was actually carrying you. 2 nurses started crying. The staff who'd avoided the break room when Margaret sat down now looked at their hands. At the ground. At anything but her face. Ashford was escorted past them all, a security guard on each side, his humiliation complete and public and exactly proportional to what he'd inflicted. His medical license suspended. His career evaporating. His strategic competence unraveling because he'd calculated for a nurse but faced a warrior. 6 months later, Margaret Walsh wore her army dress uniform to Seattle General. Major's oak leaves gleamed from her shoulders. Danny walked beside her in his own army fatigues, the one she'd signed off on his enlistment papers for. The dog tag on its broken chain hung openly now, not hidden under scrubs but worn over dress blues. It caught light like a compass pointing true north. General Morrison was waiting in the cardiac rehab gymnasium, walking with determination and purpose against the pull of a newly repaired heart. Pentagon brass surrounded him like a protective detail. When he saw Margaret, he saluted. Crisp. Deliberate. Recognition of rank and service and debt. She returned it. Military bearing. The girl who'd folded scrubs was gone. What remained was what had always been underneath. The new chief of surgery, a woman named Dr. Holloway, trained in field triage after a tour as a trauma surgeon with the Army Medical Corps, approached Margaret. Major Walsh, we'd be honored if you'd consider a position here. We need someone who understands that competence and courage matter more than hierarchy. She extended her hand. Firm grip. Recognition. Margaret glanced at the dog tag chain. At her son standing proud in uniform. At the hospital that had tried to erase her. She smiled slightly, not a big movement, just a shift in the corners of her mouth. "I'll think about it, Doctor." They walked out together, Margaret and Danny, passing the night security desk where Dr. Ashford sat in an ill-fitting guard uniform. His medical license sat at home on a shelf, waiting for a legal decision that everyone in Jacksonville already knew wouldn't go his way. His hands trembled on his phone. His eye stayed fixed on the screen as Margaret approached. She paused. Just long enough for him to know it was a choice. For him to feel the weight of her attention. When she spoke, her voice carried just far enough for him to hear it clearly. "True class is what you do when the lights go out." Then she walked past him into Jacksonville sunlight, boots clicking on polished floors, a decorated warrior who'd survived combat, erasure, humiliation, and a small man's cruelty, and emerged with her dignity intact. If you watched this and it hit you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true strength, please like and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear that quiet people sometimes carry the heaviest weight. Comment below, have you ever been judged only to prove someone dead wrong? We read every comment.